My name is Neil, pronounced Tatum, Director of Programs and Chief of Staff at the Museum of Chinese in America. So thank you so much for coming tonight. So can you actually, maybe raise your hand if this is your first time at the museum? Oh, wow. So thank you so much for bringing, new faces and new friends. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to this special conversation with Professor Tamara Venit-Shelton, focusing on her insightful work, Herbs and Roots, a history of Chinese doctors in the American medical marketplace. Professor Venit-Shelton, a distinguished professor of history at Claremont McKenna College, will guide us through the intricate narratives of Chinese medicine's evolution over 2 centuries in the US. Her research uncovers how this ancient practice was brought over by immigrants and transformed through interactions with doctors, patients, missionaries, scientists, and merchants. Herbs and Roots is a story of adaptation, resilience, and the vital role Chinese medicine has played within the American medical landscape. So this discussion will be moderated by Donna Mah, a practitioner deeply rooted in the principle of connection and collaboration fundamental to health and healing. Ma also served as a guest curator for MOCA 2018 exhibition, Chinese Medicine in America, Converging Ideas, People, and Practices. So if you enjoy tonight's program, please also consider supporting us. Your generosity is vital to our institution and supports us to create future programs that inspires and uplifts diverse communities. So you may donate on our website. Also, we welcome cash, Venmo, and PayPal. We have the QR code. And then for our virtual guests, we also encourage you to submit questions anytime during the discussion. The event is also being recorded for on-demand viewings on MOCA's YouTube channel. Of course, after the program, Professor Venit-Shelton will also, be around for also meet and greet and a little book signing. And the book, of course, is also for sale, $28. And then once again, we also accept credit cards. So, so later, if you would like to purchase a book after talk, you can come up to me and then, we take off that. So without further ado, now we hand it over to Donna to start the conversation. And thanks again for joining us tonight.
Great, thank you. I will agree with that plug, both for MOCA and its place in our community in really capturing such an important part of our American history, the Chinese history here in America, actually in the global stage. And there's a great walkthrough exhibit upstairs. And I also will put a plug in for the book as well, which reflects not only specifically the history of Chinese medicine in America, but in the context of a larger history, both here in the US and abroad, because we're always constantly influenced by a lot of different forces. And this book does a great job in looking and teasing apart these complex intersections, gosh, that are really still implicated very deeply in the world today. So, yeah. So I'd like to start off actually in light of Women's History Month, looking over the book this evening or earlier today. I honed in again because I always look in that acknowledgement section because it's like, who is this person writing this book, right? And what's the context of their story that reflects their telling? And that acknowledgement section tells an awful lot. And I'm going to land right on that last paragraph where you dedicate this book to your grandmothers. And so can you talk a little bit about the inspiration of your grandmothers in looking at Chinese medicine and at history so deeply?
Sure. Thanks, Donna. And thank you, Neil. Thanks, MOCA. I'm so glad this could finally work out. I was supposed to be here in May of 2020. Did not work out. It took a little while to get back here. But I guess I should probably start by saying I am a fourth generation Chinese American. My cousin Renord is here tonight. And I actually put a little slide in. I know this is our family, one wing of our family. So we're from San Francisco, Chinatown. The child in the middle, correct me if I'm wrong, Renord, this is the firstborn grandchild of Renaud's grandparents, my great grandparents. So, he's sort of being held aloft, Lion King baby like. And then my great grandparents, who were the immigrant generation, and all of their children, Rose, who was my grandmother, and Teresa, who was Renaud's mother. So I just wanted to put this in here because in some ways the book was inspired by our gigantic San Francisco Chinatown family. And they had a store right here on Portsmouth Square for a long time. They had that store. It's a grocery store. They also had a catering business. So we're not a family of herbalists. We don't have a medical tradition. And so it wasn't so much that I wanted to write the book because I have a bunch of herbalists or acupuncturists or practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine in my family. But I think anyone who grows up in the sort of immigrant context knows that these traditions they're just sort of like in the air. I mean, they're just kind of everywhere, and you don't think about them. It's just part of life. And we were members of Kaiser Permanente. We went to Western doctors, but if you got a cold, something really some really yucky tea would come out, right? Or a very bitter, unpleasant soup. Or, if you delivered a baby, suddenly you would have 18 aunties saying to you, "Don't you dare have cold water." There would be kind of these like vestigial echoes of things that would be transmitted. So I would say I wanted to write the book for a lot of reasons, but and most of them, to be honest, academic, because I'm a professional historian and a professor. But certainly in the back of my mind was always just those kind of family kitchen experiences that I never really thought of or thought were noteworthy. They just kind of happened, right?
Yeah, they were just there. Even my studies in Chinese medicine came later. We didn't do too much of it. When I thought about it, people were like, "Oh, what lineage? How many generations?" I'm like, not much, except when I started thinking about the soups my grandmother made, the kind of things that came out after somebody had a baby. Like there was this pig feet soup, and there was this other thing with chicken and wine and peanuts, and everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? Then when you had a black and blue and fell down, there was that funny smelling jar of tinctured herbs
Super stinky.
that was soaked in some kind of liquor
Mhm.
that my grandmother would rub, out, and I'm like, "What are you doing? Because you're just hurting me." She's like, "If I don't do this, you're going to get like arthritis when you're 80. And I'm like, it's so far beyond the pale, right? And the foods, right? There was a mussel soup, a ginseng tonic my grandmother made every year. And she caught onto the Popeye trend and basically sold it to me that it was mussel soup.
Oh.
We had to like drink it with pinching our nose. We're very dramatic. But yeah, it's so much infused in the culture, so much in the language of how people took care of themselves and their families as best they could.
And it's not just, I think, the things you consume, but the exercises you do, right? The stretches and the sort of when you wake up and you get your body moving. And I think all of these things were part of traditional Chinese therapies in a way that, I think in Western style medicine, we have a way of separating out, right? There's a sort of place that you go to be healed, or there's you go to the hospital, you go to see your doctor, right? There are healing practices. And I think traditional Chinese medicine, or the sort of many, many therapies that make up traditional Chinese medicine, are so much more infused in the ways people live.
Yeah, you're wearing a scarf is one of those things that your grandmother would approve of. And not going to bed with a wet head. I mean, we can all think of these things, right? We can just sort of like, there's so many. But yeah, thank you. Thanks for starting us off with that. But I really welcome this opportunity to be in conversation with you. I think I've always myself been a student of history, and then studying the medicine, we're often talking about the antiquity. This is a tradition that goes back thousands of years. Some people quote 2,000, 3,000, 5,000. We can really get into that. But I think the more immediate and contemporary, dare I say 2 centuries covers immediate contemporary history, also begs attention, particularly in the context of, our perception in the modern Western world of Chinese medicine really coming in to the fore in the 70s. So the work that you do actually talks and shows us that this was being practiced, this medicine was being practiced in this country, and not just in the Chinese community, but extended beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that very often when we think of Chinese medicine in the US, we do think of the 1970s. We think of Kissinger and Nixon, the opening up of China, the normalization of relations, and then that kind of splash that acupuncture made, right? This frenzy for acupuncture that really erupted in the early 70s and persists. But for me, working on this book, and I didn't start out thinking I was going to write a book, but what became the book, I realized that that's really not the beginning. And in a sense, I mean, I'll share a story. When I was trying to get the book published, you know, so you shop the book around, and the press gets reader reports, and some of the early feedback I got was, well, this isn't really American medicine. And I got that more than once. And so that really, I would say, steeled my resolve to actually make it a book and say, no, this is a long history that the presence of not just Chinese Americans, but a lot of, let's say, non-Western medical epistemologies are absolutely part of the story of American medicine. We can't tell a story of American medicine just by looking at practitioners or medical knowledge systems that come from Europe. It's a really incomplete picture. It's not explanatory. I mean, strictly from a sort of understanding history sense. So I start way back in 1799 with what I think is the first practitioner of Chinese medicine. He was selling herbs in Harrisburg and Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1799. And, you know, sorry for those of you who hated American history in high school, but we just march right on through all the way up until my book does end with Nixon and Kissinger and poor James Reston, you know, a local for all of you, a local writer for the New York Times, writer and editor for the New York Times, who had an emergency appendectomy in Beijing and wound up having acupuncture for postoperative pain. And his experience sort of awakened, or maybe reawakened, American public to Chinese medicine.
Yeah, he was an editor, and the Times actually saw to it to put his article on the front page. It was something titled like about my operation in Peking, you know.
Yes,
and it sort of opened up this whole plethora of interest. I mean, a lot was looking east already, right? I mean, we have a lot going east. We had the Beatles going to India, doing their meditation studies, and certainly we had a presence in Vietnam with the war.
Right.
So there was a lot going on in terms of a larger context, and but also this westward look for us. There's something more. We're looking for something else, right? And that just kind of really opened up, and we saw it, and we actually displayed it here, like the number of periodicals that really were fascinated and investigating, like right from Playboy to the Saturday Evening Post and Life magazine features in the 70s about acupuncture.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think so much of, there's so many great things that Western biomedicine had achieved by 1970. Absolutely. Your family practiced Western style medicine, so does mine. But I think it didn't solve all problems. And I think a lot of Americans in the 70s, because of counterculturalism, because of sort of a fascination with Eastern philosophies or Eastern religions, they were really intrigued by Chinese medicine as perhaps addressing problems that biomedical science was not well equipped to solve. And the same is true for the people that I study. I'm going to point at my relatives, but they're young. They're much younger than most of the people I study. But I mean, the same is true for Americans at the end of the 19th century who, you know, biomedicine was not yet a thing, but let's say Western style scientific medicine at that point really didn't solve the host of health problems and the sort of, you know, journey or quest for wellness that people were on. So I think there's always been this sort of this sort of impulse to look for, I don't even want to say alternatives. I just want to say to look for other ways of knowing health and practicing.
Yeah, really acknowledging
yeah.
another layer of the body, right? Another layer of like, what makes me well? What helps me be, better, right?
Yeah.
What was the impetus that got this thing started for you? What was kind of, what captured your imagination that landed you actually on this topic and this research?
Well, I started working on this book when I was living in Portland, Oregon, and no one's from Oregon. It's very far away from here. But in Oregon, pretty much everyone, let's say every sort of school child or anyone who's sort of interested in the history of Oregon learns about this this one fellow. I think I have actually this is him, Ing He. So Ing He was a Chinese immigrant, and he sold herbs out of this 2-story building way out in Eastern Oregon, in John Day, Oregon. John Day was, I think, most recently in the news when a group of kind of white nationalist Trump types took over the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. That's John Day. Okay, so just way, way out there, very impoverished community. There was a Chinese community there. They'd gone for a gold rush. They stayed to work in logging, and Ing He came. He came to be an herbalist, and he had a business partner, and they sold herbs and groceries, and they were a post office and translation service. They kind of were like a one-stop shop for the whole Chinese community. So he was out there between 1888 and 1948. He had a lot of white patients. He worked with local ranchers. He had a mail order service. So he was sending packets of herbs way out in the kind of Pacific Northwest and its hinterland. And then when he was very elderly, too elderly to be living on his own out there, his nephew came and packed him up and took him to Portland to live in a retirement home. And the nephew just locked the door. He didn't move anything out of the building. He left everything in place. So, here's another picture. Ing He, somewhat older, with one of his longtime patients. Her name was Maud Truesdale. So anyways, when the state ended up taking over this building in the 1970s, and they got some money through the Bicentennial Fund to restore it, they opened it up, and it was like Tutankhamun's tomb. I mean, everything was still there, and not just these are pictures of boxes of herbs and some of the tools that he would have used to compound prescriptions, but personal papers, letters, a lot of the just business records. There were playing cards. I mean, you could tell that people were using the space as a gathering place. They had a shrine. I mean, there was just a lot of life locked away in this building. So anyways, I say all of this because in Oregon, people know about Ing He, and he was the subject of a documentary and all of that. So I was teaching in Oregon. I learned about him, and I thought, oh, that's so interesting. I wonder how many more of these guys were there, right? Maybe I had a summer where I thought, maybe I'll just kind of poke around. Maybe I'm a quantitative social historian. So this is what I say. I was like, I'm going to count them, like, because quantitative social, we just like to count things. We're like, is there something in the past we can count? I'm going to count it. Anyway, so I started looking for them, and they were just everywhere. I mean, Chinese herbalists were everywhere. And I didn't mean to write a book. I really didn't. But all of a sudden I realized, no, this is a book. I mean, this is a whole history that I think even within our own Chinese American community, we don't have a real tradition of talking about these things, right? And because I think, again, like how we started off, it's sort of a normal, uninteresting thing, right? But it was a great sort of detective type of project because I would find someone, and then I'd follow him around the country, looking at where he landed, or I would find, very often I would go and give a talk, and maybe a descendant would come up to me and say, oh, my father was an herbalist in Idaho Falls. My father was an herbalist in Butte, Montana. I mean, I still get emails from people who are trying to do their own family histories. At this point, I think a lot of us of our generation, especially as our sort of elders are passing away, are thinking, oh man, I wish I had asked them more questions while they were alive, right? They're never going to volunteer that
Oh,
information.
never, and never.
but-
And even if you do ask, they might not even answer.
Oh,
You
they're
know,
like,
this
"So
is, yeah,
long ago."
please just don't talk about that stuff. It's in the past. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. This story of Doc, well, we called, I guess he's also
Doc
referred to
Hay.
as Doc Hay, right?
Mhm.
Because he was really the doctor for the community in John Day. And because there weren't very many doctors. I mean, I think we think of the MD, the AMA as being very prevalent, very influential, really big part of kind of like determining what was legal and not legal in terms of medical practice. But there weren't a lot of doctors in these hinterlands,
No.
right?
No.
And in fact, the curators, when we did the 2018 exhibit, they actually traveled out to John Day.
Yeah.
And I didn't even realize how east it was, because you think Oregon, I think Portland. They're like, no, we flew into Boise, Idaho, and it was only 4 hours from Boise, whereas it would have been like 6 hours from Portland. I was like, wow. So it's really
Far.
sort of in the middle of nowhere.
Mhm.
I just Boise, incidentally, I think of potatoes, like, you know, because you're sitting here on the East Coast, but the second largest Chinese population,
Yes.
second to San Francisco at
Yeah.
one point in history,
Yeah.
right?
And I think maybe one of the very few places that licensed Chinese herbalists.
Yeah.
And only one, actually.
Yeah,
only
one guy.
One guy.
One guy.
But
yeah.
but no, and Wyoming, Montana, these places had thriving Chinese communities, not large, but significant, and herbalists were there and were serving not only their own community, but also non-Chinese in the
Right.
area.
Yeah. No, and this brings another important point. I just think in terms of general Chinese medicine education, nowadays, contemporary studies, we think about acupuncture first when we think about Chinese medicine, primarily, but I've often have to draw the chart and say acupuncture is but what modality, right, of a vast modality. And herbal medicine is really this sort of bigger, more prevalent practice of Chinese medicine. And with acupuncture, often moxibustion, right? And these are sort of the tools of like external intervention. This is considered internal medicine. And how it's different from an herbal perspective versus Western medicine. We're hardly ever like using one herb, you know, kind of in, you know, only. It's formulations, it's compounding, as you say, different herbal formulas in combination on theories and practices that are thousands of years old.
Yeah.
Really an understanding, kind of a sacred understanding of how these things interact in the body, you know. And it kind of like befuddles a lot of kind of Western medicine perspectives, which thinks pharmacologically, right? In a pharmaceutical perspective, one agent, what's the effect, what's the biomechanism? And this is sort of more kind of recipes. And I don't want to like dilute that it's not medicine by alluding to recipes and food, but there is that crossover component as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that. I think you really do, when you're talking about traditional Chinese therapies, have to step outside of what we've normalized in this biomedical paradigm, this very kind of disease specific or system specific, right? What's the biomechanism by which this active agent is happening? Because it is the whole body as a system, but also the body in its environment, and its social environment, and its natural environment. And you know, there's a lot of feedback. Okay, there we go. It actually puts me to mind of, again, when I was working on the book and someone said to me, "You're calling them doctors. Why are you calling them doctors?" Because it didn't seem like what they were practicing counted as medicine, right? And so they said, "Why don't you call them healers or, you know, something else?" And I was like, well, because they called themselves doctors. You know, when they talk to their patients, that's the word that they used. And so again, I think it's sort of part of my whole story of reclaiming this space for Chinese medicine in the medical marketplace, and in this American medical marketplace, right, is to say these are Chinese doctors, right? They don't have MDs.
Right.
Maybe a very few of them later on did, but most of them didn't, but they're still doctors.
Right. In fact, doctors didn't always have an MD either, right? I mean,
True.
it's a new thing, right? I mean, yeah, that's sort of the context that we have to be thinking about, right? This history of, and you frame this as the medical marketplace. Can you talk to us a little bit about that phrasing and the meaning of it? Because we were talking earlier, when we think about medicine and health, we think about the noble profession of healing, care, but we don't think about market and a marketplace in particular, but I think all of us know it nowadays, it is a market. It's an economy, and there are considerations that we are very well aware of nowadays, but we're always part of the picture.
Yeah. No, I think it's not my own term. I mean, I'll start by saying that I think a lot of historians of medicine do talk about the marketplace or the market where services were exchanged for money or bartered for goods. And I think for the doctors that I write about, they were entrepreneurs. I mean, I think that's kind of the main thing that I walked away with at the end of the project was this sort of astonishment and respect for what they did, not just as healers, but also as business people in an extremely hostile environment, right? Not only are they facing, let's just say sort of your basic run-of-the-mill anti-Chinese racism, but the marketplace was set up and constrained by the end of the 19th century in ways that deliberately tried to push them out. So they were not eligible to be licensed when licensing emerged in the last 3 decades of the 19th century. They were surveilled by police. They were arrested. They were fined. They were prosecuted. Some of them were sent to jail. Some of them just sort of accepted that they would be in jail periodically. And so I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to realize that these are people who were compelled, you know, they saw themselves as having a calling, right? I mean, I think that's true. They weren't just sort of in it for the money, but they were also very savvy, pragmatic business people. I mean, they had families they were supporting. I mean, they were not, let's say, overly idealistic about what they were doing.
Right. Yeah. There was real consciousness around the business,
Mhm.
around the risks, and, you know, the practice. We were going to meet earlier. We didn't get a chance to, but just down the block on Grand Street, you know, Camo is a herbal dispensary that many practitioners in the U.S. use. And very much in this story, 4th generation practitioners of Chinese medicine, China, Hong Kong, now here in New York. But similarly, in the 70s, arrested, you know, kind of having to sort of be accountable to, you know, government, and maybe rightfully so. We need a little oversight, making sure that there isn't sort of like shady stuff going on, but really accountable and explaining, and ultimately also instructing new immigrant practitioners that were coming in about like how to operate, what lane to move in. And I think this is also speaks to something of the immigrant communities, this kind of networking, this kind of brotherhood or association that are very characteristic, that must have emerged in your studies as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think these are family businesses, and extended kinship type family businesses. But I would say for the most part, people who practice Chinese medicine in this country had some prior experience in a business in China. So before the 1970s, acupuncture, it did exist. I mean, it has existed, you know, for thousands of years, but up until really the end of the 19th century, they really weren't capable of making those little hollow core needles. If you has anyone had acupuncture, you know what I'm talking about. It's very, very thin needles. So those are produced, those are not produced until industrialization makes it possible to produce them, right? Prior to that, they're much bigger and a little bit more like little tiny scalpels. I think they also use something that's like little tiny forceps. I mean, it was street surgery. It was basically like the blood was supposed to flow. It was the qi flowing.
That's right. It was not comfortable. I remember talking to my grandmother,
Yeah.
oh, get acupuncture. And she looked at me like I was out of my, that's painful.
Yeah.
And I realized, of course, her association with needles were not these machine wrought thin pins that
Right.
we were using.
Yeah.
There was something somebody actually made, but also had to be able to be autoclaved.
Yeah.
So they had to be pretty thick.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, it was sterilization was a thing.
Yeah, you probably don't even want to know where that's been. So I mean, the folks that I write about many of them knew about acupuncture. A couple of them actually, they might have had a set of needles, but they didn't practice it. It wasn't something that people of their class did. It was more something that was done in the streets by sort of lower class healers. Technicians, right. So, the people who came to this country beginning in the 1850s tended to be affiliated with a shop, and a shop would have produced a single proprietary remedy. And then they come here and all of a sudden they're general practitioners, right? So they come with basically the equivalent of textbooks, right? Or giant kind of manuals that tell them how to compound for all manner of ailments. And they really depend on one another. So one of the things I have are letters that herbalists wrote to one another. And they'll say things like, I have a patient and they have, I don't know, pick something, right? Hemorrhoids was a kind of common one, to be honest. Like that was the first thing that came to mind. I have a letter that says my patient has hemorrhoids. Anyways, so they would write to each other and they would say, what should I do, right? Because they weren't trained in all things. So they do depend a lot on each other. The other thing that they do, and I think I have, hold on, let me see what else. I brought some examples of Chinese advertisements. I'm going to skip ahead to the one that I want to show. Okay, so I wanted to show this because really beginning in the very end of the 19th century, as the technology of printing gets a lot better, it becomes a lot cheaper to produce these much more detailed illustrations. Chinese doctors, one of the, I think, wonderful things that they do for one another is they share the plates. They share the plates that they would have used for advertising. So this is maybe not the best example, but these are the one at the top, it says pulse diagnosis. You can actually see they made a plate based on this photograph. These two gentlemen over here on your right were had an herb shop, and the white fellow on the left was essentially like an investor. He, I think they called him their secretary. I think he did some kinds of translation work, writing their advertising copy and that sort of thing. But so they have this photograph, and then they made an advertising plate based on it. And then they sold they sold it, right, to this other guy across town. And he just kind of used part of it in his ad. And then later they revised the whole thing and they get an image of a woman. And so, I mean, I have lots of examples. This is maybe not the most exciting one, but I take this as a sign that they're talking to each other and they're helping each other. They're not just competitors. Some of them are members of one very big extended family. So not actually these two guys, but in some cases that was the case. So they would sort of like franchise like Bakfu would have a place in Oakland, and then he would send a couple of his nephews or sons across the bay to San Francisco, right? And they would kind of fan out that way. But they know each other, they're talking to each other. Sometimes they get in fights, but I think they help each other out a lot.
Right. They're definitely aware of each other and they're kind of coexisting, right? Like sometimes elbows out, but sometimes collaborating, like all good families. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about kind of context, and we've alluded to this. You mentioned anti-Chinese sentiment. I think this is kind of on the front of my mind after what we went through during the COVID pandemic across the country. Of what kind of felt like a resurgence, caught me completely by surprise. Being a long-term New York resident, never seen anything like this in my lifetime, although I had heard and knew history from my parents and grandparents about this kind of thing happening.
Mm-hmm.
What was the context of history and precedent around what these ancestors of ours really kind of survived and thrived through?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think absolutely, given, the experience of the resurgence of anti-Asian violence during COVID, I think it's one that makes this history feel very present again. The puzzle, right, for a historian is how to explain that these two opposite things are happening at the same time. Because on one hand, these doctors, as you can tell, they're advertising in English, right? They do advertise in Chinese language newspapers too, but these are examples from English language advertisements. They have a lot of white clientele. They have a lot of English speaking and in Los Angeles, especially a lot of Spanish speaking clientele because the location of Chinatown is right by this very large and very old Mexican and Mexican-American community. So Chinese medicine was extremely popular in places like San Francisco and Boston, New York, Los Angeles, in places like Boise, Idaho, Butte, Montana. I mean, there are lots and lots of places where white people are regularly consulting with Chinese herbalists. And at the same time, this is exactly the same time as Chinese people and their neighborhoods are being pathologized as filthy, diseased, fit for forcible quarantine, mandatory vaccination campaigns, if not outright expulsion and exclusion. So yeah, I think it's a hard thing, I guess, as a historian to figure out, right? It's not necessarily different people who are simultaneously seeking health advice and also medically scapegoating the very same people. But what you do see is that Chinese doctors really more, I would say, let's say the Chinese doctors who'd been in the country 2 decades or more began to leave Chinatown. And I think this is because they want to separate themselves from Chinatown as a place that is subject to a lot of public health surveillance, quarantine, kind of targeted for violence. They do start to move their businesses out of Chinatown, and they'll move them into white areas. One of the people who I interviewed for this project, her father had immigrated as a teenager to work in his uncle's herb shop in Oakland. And then he was sort of a peripatetic guy. He moved something like 19 times in 18 years. And I asked her why. She said he just got bored. So he wasn't driven out. He just really got bored. So he moved kind of all over the American West with his American-born Chinese wife, and I think they had 11 children, but maybe it was 9. They had a lot of children. Anyway, she was the youngest one. And she said that whenever they would show up in a new town, he would immediately figure out where the Chinatown was and then go rent a house in the white part of town. And I think it was because he didn't want to be associated with that sort of pathologized Chinese race, right?
Right. Maybe the new immigrants, the folks that were coming in that maybe were not English speaking, whatever it might have been, right?
I think though, I mean, if we're really talking about the 1910s, right? This is the era of Chinese exclusion.
Right.
So there's still a lot of new entries. But this is not, say, a post-1949 moment where there's this, I think more recently has become this really deep fissure in Chinese American communities between people whose families who were here before 49
Right.
and then the families after. I mean, the people who were immigrating around the turn of the 19th century were not, from a class perspective or even from a regional perspective, all that different from the folks who'd been here before. But I think it is a sort of maybe an assimilation effect that the sort of older generations of immigrants, people who came 1850, 1880, that sort of era, felt like they had more to lose, more at stake, by associating with folks who are coming over more recently.
Right. And it sort of fits into that pattern of aspiration,
Mhm.
right? That other groups, non-Asian and Asian alike, that would have fallen into, we sort of start together
Mhm.
and then we begin differentiating and becoming, as you say, assimilated into a broader
Right.
kind of like
And
context.
leaving Chinatown, like
Leaving
our
Chinatown.
family all left
Yeah.
Chinatown, right, Nord?
Yeah.
That was the dream, was not to live in Chinatown anymore, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I still do and live in Chinatown.
Yeah,
People like,
yeah.
you still like it, you get, I'm like, yeah, it's fine. But yeah, that's usually you like want to move out.
Mhm.
You're supposed to spread your wings.
Right, right.
Yeah, that's sort of what that American dream looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah. How many of the research that you did were businesses or practices that were intergenerational? where there was
Oh, so
succession.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, these were really family businesses. And it was fathers and sons and fathers and nephews. It was also wives. And this, I was saying to Donna earlier, I will tell like one quick story. So this is the family. This is Chan Du-sung, who was very peripatetic, who he, moved 19 times in 18 years. And his wife, Astor Lee, was born in San Francisco. She was it's actually very easy to find her in the U.S. Census because she's one of about 16 Chinese people who were born in her decade because women were excluded, right? So her father was a wagon driver, which was a good job back then, and her mother was I wanted to say saloon girl, but what do I mean? Prostitute. That's what I mean. She was a prostitute. It said on the census saloon girl, but we all know what that means. So anyway, so Astor Lee, so I started researching this family, and this was kind of fairly on in my research, and I kept getting these questions like, where are the women, right? Like you're talking so much about these Chinese men and these herbalists and these fathers and sons and nephews and blah, blah, blah. I was like, oh, well, Chinese culture is very, very patriarchal. So then, the women are not practicing medicine. Oh, yes, they were. They were just in the back. And so when I started interviewing descendants of this couple, they would say, oh, yeah, dad would always be dressed in a suit and he would be in the front room receiving the patients. And mom would be in the back room compounding all the medicine. And it was, now I sort of think, well, duh. Like, what, are you not a feminist? Like, what happened to you? But all of a sudden, if I looked in the back, there all the women were. So, you'll get these census records where it'll say, Lipo Tai is the herbalist and he has all these herbal assistants, men. And then 4 or 5 women who are housekeepers. And those were the women who were in the back actually doing the work of, compounding the medicine. So for me, this was, to talk to their children who are now quite elderly in their 90s was a very useful reminder of, you got to go in the back and look for the women. And once I started looking for them, then they were everywhere too. And so I do have some stories I tell in the book of this sort of kind of around the 20s and 30s, as the earliest generations of Chinese herbalists are dying, and their children have opportunities to enter into licensed professions, right? Which was something that had not been open to Asian Americans prior to that. There is this sort of moment where these businesses do start to fall apart because it's hard to be unlicensed, right? It's hard. They have a tough job, and so sometimes the wives try to take it over when the husbands die. And that doesn't usually go very well. But sometimes they have a child, either a son or a daughter, who becomes a chiropractor or becomes a pharmacist or an MD, and they're able to keep the family business going multi-generationally through these other businesses.
Right. Thank you. Because I love this herb specialist, right?
Yes.
Like, doesn't say herbalist or herbal medicine, right? It's specialist, really careful language to
Yeah.
make sure it stays just under the radar. I'm just going to step back for a second because I'm just sort of going back to thinking, yesterday I just was struck by, it was like March 13th, which was the day that the whole pandemic was declared in 2020, right? So this mark. And so this book was published in 2019.
Yeah.
How many years did you work on it?
I started working on it in 2011. Okay. So it took 8 years.
Yeah, it's an 8-year project.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could feel the 8 years. I mean,
there's
so much detail and so many layers and places and people that you cover that really illustrate, the kind of moving history. But thinking about the time that, you were moving to get this published to the time that we have now, what were the drives of your curiosity, right, that you can name that I really hope we can plant with this audience? Because I think this kind of curiosity and this investigation can't do it at the level that you would do it. Like, what are the drives and the lessons learned for you?
Yeah.
from this, if you can name a few?
I mean, I will say, I think a community needs to take care of its own health. I mean, I think for me and it isn't just this book, but I feel like other things that I've worked on since 2019, really thinking about how kind of beyond the sort of biomedical institutions, beyond hospitals, beyond people with MDs, how does a community attend to its own health, right? And that just feels like, especially in the context of the pandemic, so important that we all, with or without training, became much more clued into how important that network is, right? And it's really important for these folks because they are, extremely marginalized, extremely vulnerable, not just in terms of kind of their poverty making them vulnerable to all sorts of kind of violence and health concerns, but also the kind of the precarity of their professional existence. But I think it's true now too that we live in these communities where it's easy to feel very isolated from one another and not to recognize our mutual dependence. But something like the pandemic comes around and it really does remind you, we're kind of in this together, and we have to understand that we should all care for one another, right?
Right. The words of marginalized, and the racial, the racism isn't often something that we talk about until recently, like in the last. I think we often will consider Asian communities, Chinese American communities, under this kind of trope of the model minority, right? And I think these stories, while it shows a more complete picture, incredible success, incredible resilience, and the context in the face of all of this, right? That was always kind of part of the story, and that's really important.
Well, can I ask you how was the pandemic experience from your perspective as a practitioner here?
We were shut down right away because we were kind of deemed in the state to be non-essential. And so a lot of us, and I don't know if anybody remembers those early days, we didn't, was it going to be a week or 2 weeks? I remember being in the conversation with friends, and one of them said, no, I think this is going to go for till May. And to me, that was unheard of, because I was just thinking it was just going to be 2 weeks, March 13th, we're going to get to the end of March, and we're going to be okay, things with Ebola and SARS, and this was definitely not that. I will tell you, in tribute to my grandmother, that one of the first things that we noticed flying off the shelves was rice. All of a sudden, our older folks were beginning to, they already hoard
I know.
rice and toilet paper, right? I mean, those were the big signs. We're like, oh, something's going on here. And I running to start shopping, I started stocking the stuff that my grandmother had, in these funny bins, those bean thread noodles and shiitake mushrooms. I think I bought 2 pounds of those. I bought whole chickens and had them quartered and threw them in the freezer, because I was like, I can't do much with a couple of boxes of chicken nuggets, but you got a couple of quartered chickens, you'll be okay for a month or two, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so it was really funny to not realize, again, the influence of our elders that we always just took for granted, but encoded that my grandmother, she had this giant rice bin, filled it, 25-pound bag of rice all the time. Even when it was just her and my aunt living, I'm like, why do you need all that rice? I buy rice in a 2-pound pack. But no, she always, and I realized it was that wartime mentality, that what she survived. And it was just, I really felt visited by her, and kind of in an interesting communion with her and my grandfather, all of them, just because of what I remembered we would always go shopping for, dried sausage. You went to the Lapchung store. We went to, you can make a lot of things, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
But
it's true.
But it got quiet. I mean, Chinatown's so bustling, and every now and again I'll be walking, and I'll be frustrated because I can't get around people. But I'm like, wait a second. I remember the days, and our friends that are here, it was abysmally empty. You could look, there was no cars, and it was really dystopian. It really felt like it was out of a movie. And how long was this going to last? And so there was this own internal kind of terror that we didn't really know how to acknowledge.
Yeah.
I mean, Zoom, thank good. I mean, I stayed, there was work and classes and teaching that I was doing over Zoom, but it wasn't the same. It
Yeah.
wasn't the same.
No,
You know,
it
yeah.
doesn't replace for the actual face-to-face community togetherness. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's sort of like get hit in the throes of the many, many social crises that we sort of had to really like face
Mhm.
and still need to face and rectify. You know, Black Lives Matter movement, you know, the anti-Asian sentiment,
Mhm.
you know, just everything that's continuing to happen.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of that. I think to your point about health and healing,
Mhm.
there's a lot of reserves we need to be building for
Yeah.
ourselves because there's a lot of work to be done
Yeah.
still. Yeah.
There sure is.
Yeah. So what else was I had another question for you.
Yeah, how are we doing on time?
yeah,
I feel like we.
Oh yeah, maybe we want to ask 4
You wanna
questions.
turn over to-
Yeah, open it up.
A few questions online, but maybe just, people, you can just, raise your hand, and then maybe I'll have to trouble you to repeat the questions as well.
Okay.
Or your audience, but you can, since, the ad for everything, you can just, okay.
Okay, so was Chinese traditional medicine subject to the attacks like alternative medicine from the allopathic
Yeah.
movement? Side of the attack, Chinese
So do you want me to repeat the question, Lynell? Okay, yeah, so the question is really, it's a good one. It's were practitioners of Chinese medicine subject to the attacks by allopathic, or we could call them orthodox or regular doctors? And the answer is yes. So this is a big part of my research, was looking at the ways that as in the 19th century, as let's say formally trained elite white doctors, we might think of as allopathic or regular orthodox, are kind of consolidating their control over the American medical marketplace. One of the really important ways that they distinguish themselves from the folks that they're trying to exclude is by attacking the folks that they're trying to exclude. And so the Chinese doctors are kind of a perfect target for those attacks because one, because they're racially marked and they are not subject to the same kinds of legal protections as their white counterparts in the medical marketplace, but also because it became easy to kind of describe what the Chinese did as anti-modern, as kind of based in superstition, based in magic or miracle working, and then draw this line around what allopathic doctors were doing that was scientific and objective and rational. And I say this, it's hard to kind of put yourself back into this moment, but between the 1870s and 1900, when these attacks are really kind of most, I would say, most coordinated, most powerful, scientific medicine has not cured a single disease. They don't have a vaccine that works. Surgery is still more likely to kill you than not. What regular physicians had, and they didn't really have a great grasp on it, is they were starting to believe in the germ theory of disease. So, 1864, right? Pasteur basically through his experiments on fermentation starts to think, oh, there are these microorganisms that might cause disease. 1883 to 1885, Koch in Germany finally isolates and demonstrates that there are these bacteria that are disease causing for things like tuberculosis. But all of this is still very much kind of embryonic and forming. And so attacks on Chinese doctors do become this way for a set of people who are not that cohesive and not that sure about the efficacy of their medicine to distinguish themselves and to say, we might not know exactly who we are, but we know we're not that. Correct, right. So they get involved in surveilling Chinese doctors. They'll do sting operations. They'll go undercover and pretend to be patients and then catch them in the act of prescribing drugs and diagnosing and prescribing drugs, which they weren't supposed to be doing. They work with state boards, or they get themselves elected to state boards or appointed to state boards, I should say. So they have this sort of concerted and coordinated efforts to drive Chinese doctors out of business and then kind of elevate themselves and start to secure the monopoly on the marketplace.
Yeah, they established licensure, right? And
Yeah.
with the establishment of licensure for the regular practitioners, there's no pathway for licensure for the, as you say, irregular, right?
Yeah.
The other folks, and that includes homeopathic practitioners.
Yeah,
as well,
it
right?
depends state by state. So in some states, so Texas is a state actually, Renard's. I'm going to out you as a Texan. See, he identifies as a New Yorker now, but he's from Texas. I know, I'm sorry, but Texas is a place I think where no, actually it's osteopaths. Anyway, it's kind of a state by state thing. In some places, osteopaths and homeopaths and chiropractors do a better job of getting themselves, kind of wedging themselves into state boards of health. But for the most part, it is these sort of what we might think of as regular doctors or really people who belong to the AMA. But I was actually just reading, there's a great thing. What was I just reading? Oh, this document from kind of around like 1906, where this AMA doctor is saying, well, we don't know what we do, but we know that it's not that. You know?
Literally, yeah.
We might not agree and we don't know what we do, but we know it's not that. Yeah.
Whatever that is.
Whatever that
Yeah.
is, right? Chinese medicine, osteopathy, right? Whatever.
And that persists to this
Yeah.
day, sadly. Maybe not so much always and everywhere, thankfully.
Mhm.
I've got a good number of colleagues that I coordinate and collaborate with on
Yeah.
the other side that we're always in conversation and working collaboratively in this integrative model.
Yeah.
But it does persist, you know. And
But now you're licensed. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
so now we're
that's a
licensed.
huge
so
thing,
the
right?
licensure happens like what first? It's the first state to get to license acupuncture. So acupuncture, interestingly, is the modality of licensure.
Mhm,
The modality of medicine that's licensed. And Nevada is the first state
Yeah.
to license acupuncture in, 70.
It's early,
I think.
73, I
Yeah,
think,
70.
yeah, and then California is
Yeah.
the next year.
And then California comes after. And then shortly after that, state by state, we start establishing licensure. But herbalists kind of like get captured in that if you have an acupuncture license. So it got tricky. But a
Yeah.
lot of folks were arrested for practicing literally medicine without a license, including Doc K. Right?
Yeah,
He's actually
yeah.
arrested 3 times, but actually never convicted. That was another great story.
And their patients show up for them really in
Right.
those moments. There are a lot of very moving testimonies, from trial.
Lee was a big story. Speaking of women in the
Mhm.
medicine.
Oh, Miriam Lee. Yeah, much so 1970s. Miriam Lee.
Yeah.
She was from Singapore, I think, and she practiced medicine. She worked at Hewlett Packard on the line, right? And at night she would treat people in her Palo Alto apartment. And her students, I mean, talk about intergenerational kind of training, right? Her students, she's passed away, but
Yeah.
they love
Still to
her.
this
I mean,
day,
still
yeah,
to this
yeah,
day,
to
it's
this day, yeah.
yeah, she really inspired a lot of practitioners.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? Oh,
Through your research, I'm trying to understand that early 1900 period, you said there were a lot of white nations that
Yeah.
would go to Europe. How do they know,
Yeah.
and why do they want to? And because I can see, from the exclusion act, I can see how that would be modified.
Mhm.
I'm just wondering, other than this exception,
If they had a choice to go see a white doctor. So that's a great question. And I think there are a number of ways to answer that. One is that Chinese doctors were advertising to them really from very early on, even things like, what some of them did. But more often they were hiring translators. So they would have usually a woman, a young English speaking or Spanish speaking woman would work at the front and would help them write signs in English. So from way back there there are records from Sacramento and San Francisco, I think as early as about 18, I'm trying to think about my earliest one. I don't know that I have one from the 1860s, but I have an example from the 1870s for sure, where someone has written his sign in Chinese and English, right? So he's clearly trying to reach out, right? And then later in the 1880s, 1890s, as they start to advertise in newspapers with these kinds of things I was showing. These are some of my favorites. This is from Eastern Oregon. I just love them. There's a real one is right there. But let's see. Like this is one from 1880. This fellow practiced in Los Angeles. And the flip side of it is, I don't have a reproduction of it because it's really badly water damaged and it doesn't show very well, but it's in English and Spanish. So he didn't speak English and Spanish. He probably knew just enough to kind of get by. But he had young English and Spanish speaking women who worked for him. And so, why would they go? So they would go because these doctors were actively recruiting them. I think they also went because what regular medicine was at the time, and I think this is something that still probably resonates with a lot of your clientele. What regular medicine was at the time tended to be very invasive, often, especially for women, often kind of driving toward these sorts of remedies that were very violent, that would produce a kind of violent response in the system, or they would be driving towards surgeries. And so a lot of the letters I have of white patients who go and seek care from Chinese doctors are saying things like, I have a growth, and I don't want it. I want you to reduce it with herbs. Like I'm afraid of the knife. Or in the case of women, especially once abortion becomes a felony in the early part of the 20th century, it varies, but let's say around the turn of the 20th century, Chinese herbalists were providing abortions. They were doing a lot of things that kind of the regular doctor, the white doctors wouldn't do, or and I don't have evidence of this, but I think for some patients, it was a privacy thing that so Chinese doctors were experts in venereal disease. That's one of the things that they advertise, is they can cure venereal disease. So I don't have any patient testimonies that say, that expressly, but I can well imagine that maybe you don't want to talk to your family doctor about your syphilis or your gonorrhea, right? So you want to go and have a kind of anonymous experience in Chinatown. So I think there are a lot of reasons.
Yeah, you not be subject to Department of Health, census things, and then just in terms of the method of practice, we don't have to necessarily go for the symptom, right? Chinese medicine is going to really go for this kind of holistic, systemic approach. And so you don't really need to know too much. You do this pulse diagnosis, this tongue diagnosis, and the effort then is to kind of help the system rebalance or be rebalanced, right? Take out what you no longer want that contributes to that growth and restrike a balance. So the whole method of medicine is very different than what's developing in the allopathic realm. Yeah.
So I have two only. So the first one is how dangerous is mixing Eastern herbal medicine and Western medicine?
How dangerous is it?
Yeah. Or how not dangerous?
Yeah. Well, I guess disclosure is the most important thing, right? So if you're working with a Chinese medicine practitioner and you're working with and your physician, and in New York State, we're required when we're kind of doing the consent form that you need to be seeing a physician, which is not what I call myself, right? As for this, whatever you're seeing me for, I'm not the primary care provider. That being said, this care can be collaborated. It can be coordinated, full disclosure of medication. So it gets dangerous when we're not talking about the whole story, when we don't have the whole picture. So full disclosure of medications, background of, disease, surgeries, supplements that someone's taking, really needs to be cross-referenced so that we're really working, with the full picture.
In the 1800s and early 1900s, was there any kind of commemorate between Chinese doctors and other marginalized communities, groups, for example, like Black communities and healers?
What was,
Like, commemorate.
oh, that is an interesting question. Okay, so the only, I'm sure that it happened frequently, but it is not often captured in the historical record. So things that give me a sense that it was happening more frequently than we see in the record. We do know from historical archaeology of kind of work camps that there was a lot of mixing of Chinese remedies and indigenous medicines. So we know that that was happening frequently. But is there sort of archive, the kind of documents that would be collected in an archive saying, Native peoples and Chinese were working together at healing? No.
Quantitative.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. But historical archaeology is actually very useful to be suggestive about that. I have a lot of arrest records that show that, for example, Black physicians were being kind of swept up with Chinese physicians and raids and this sort of policing efforts. But yeah, I assume it is happening. And it's just, that's a sort of like the fault of historical record keeping that we don't know more about it.
That's awesome. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for this insightful
Thank
conversation.
you.
You.